Hi and welcome to this week's lecture. We're going to be looking at getting out of the classroom and thinking about visiting museums and or other sites of historical interest, and think about how we can make the most of those opportunities. They're relatively rare in the academic year. They take a lot of planning. They're relatively resource intensive in terms of people and money, so we need to make sure we get the most out of these and think really clearly about what the historical learning value added is going to be. So we're going to start by just saying a little something about museums and what kind of places they are and what kind of cultural value they might have to us as history teachers. Here's a quote from Lumley's written about museums and museum education. He says, "It's through museums that societies represent their relationship to their own history and that of other cultures and people." But he also points out that today there are great differences and conflicts, both inside and outside museums, about how that should be done. So this opens up the very notion of museums in our culture, in contemporary culture that is around the world, as sites of contestation, that there's a debate among people in museums and between different institutions about the best way to go about doing their business. And Lumley says in finding solutions to those debates, he's worried about at least three contemporary trends in museums. The first, he says, is around commercialization. There are increasing pressures on museums to engage in commercial activities. So there's a lot more focus on how you use marketing and the shop to sustain the museum as a business entity. But also, he says, in an increasingly commercialized environment, museums are having to sell themselves to potential visitors as sites of entertainment. So that the whole commercialization agenda starts to distort slightly what museums do and how they present themselves to the public. The second thing that's going on in the world of museums at the moment is the pursuit of realism. Now this is developed in different museums and in different places around the world, but he says that there is a pursuit in many modern museums to engage in creating kind of complete immersion scenario. So we have reconstructions, we have opportunities to dress up, we have rooms that try to recreate the smells of the period of time that are being created. And then he says that brings with it an element of theatricality and invention, and that can marginalise the focus that we're interested in on the construction of historical interpretations. And then thirdly, he says museums are having to compete for people's attention in a world completely saturated with media and media constructions and reconstructions of history. So in films, in period drama, in novels, children can access any information they want on mobile phones, and all of those kinds of things start to crowd out museums' unique offering as places where you go to learn about history, because history is all around children and is accessible in all forms of media. So this leads us to think about, well, what is it museums do? And really, the book I was just quoting from, Goodacre and Baldwin, they suggest that there are several purposes for museums, but two of the most popularly cited when you talk to people who work in museums are firstly to preserve and display collections, and secondly to educate those who visit in the collections. So museum educators can therefore make a distinctive contribution to history education through both, through displaying collections that are full of valuable artifacts and through their more deliberate educational mission to teach people who come through the doors of their institution something about the collection and the period and the value that they place on these artifacts. So I'm going to suggest that there are at least three levels of thinking about pedagogical practice in museums. The first is the curatorial story, the story presented by the curators, which gives us a narrative that organises our thinking as visitors. So we don't just go in and engage with a bunch of objects. These objects have already been selected, they've been edited to some extent, they've been put together in a certain pattern, they've been clustered in certain ways, and that communicates to us some important stories about the themes and organising concepts and ideas that the curator wants to implant in our heads, really, to help us make sense of these collections and the period of time that they're engaging with. The second level of thinking about museum pedagogy is the more deliberate educational projects that they offer, and obviously some of the more distinct museum pedagogic practices revolve around working hands-on with artefacts. Obviously, and they can do that more than we can do in the classroom because they have access to artefacts and they're trained in how to use and interpret them. And then the third way in which we can think about museums as sites of pedagogy is that the way the building is set up can set up certain forms of expectations and certain messages, and modern museum architecture really reflects this in quite dramatic ways. So on the right hand side here we've got a picture of the Jewish Museum in Berlin, designed by Libeskind, and on the left hand we've got Dominik's Documentation Centre in Nuremberg, both in Germany, both dealing with aspects of the Holocaust, so a very sensitive area of history, especially in the German context. And both designers have done some dramatic things with the building. So on the left, this is the Documentation Centre. It's right next to the Nuremberg rally grounds. And you can see here the designer has adopted this approach of driving spears or wedges through the building. And this is to demonstrate that he wants to drive a wedge through the monolithic totalitarian assumptions of the Nazi period. So he's using his building style to create some very distinctive and challenging messages about how we can best encounter this totalitarian regime. And on the right hand side, in a similar style, but this is more focused on the Holocaust, Libeskind has created a very angular building, and within that there are a number of spaces which create awkwardness. There are spaces in which as you move through walkways, the space for the visitor gets smaller and smaller and forces you to feel a level of discomfort. There are spaces which you can see but you can't access, and this is all designed to create in the visitor a sense of dislocation and a sense of places and spaces where you just can't go. And so before you even get to think about decisions the museum is making about artifacts and how to sequence those artifacts, the architects have built in some really profound ideas to challenge our assumptions and to feed into the way we experience these ideas. So I've mentioned several times already that one of the most obvious features of a museum is that it's full of artifacts. So just thinking about this as the entry level, if you like, to think about the educational potential. We have artifacts, we have collections, and they enable students to experience the physicality of evidence, to see the size and quality of evidence. Perhaps, if you're working with a museum educator, to feel and handle that evidence, or at least recreations of the evidence, so children can get some sense of what it is like to handle these kinds of materials from the past. It's also useful for the students to see examples of objects clustered together from a time or place. That can create some impression of what a room or a setting might actually feel like if it was full of individual artifacts. And then finally, it gives children an opportunity to think about the materials, the decoration, the craftsmanship. In short, to clue into some ideas about the kind of cultures that created these artifacts. So just handling goods, handling the physical material on which museum collections are based is a useful and distinctive thing that we often can't replicate in the classroom. So if nothing else, it's worth going to museums so that we can benefit from this level of engagement. Sword puts it like this. She says, the functions of many objects are multifaceted and complex. And an example of this Egyptian coffin, for example, it's made not just to hold a body, but to hold a belief system. The body is contained in the coffin, and the belief system is contained in its style. If we're primarily interested in learning, we must create situations where children's own perceptions become the steps up which they climb. So by encouraging children to look at this, to state what they see, to think about the level of craftsmanship that went into it, to think about the symbolism, to think about the pattern, to think about the decoration, to think about the amount of money it would have cost to produce artifacts like this, but they can begin to climb into this as an artifact which has a symbolic significance. So climb into the meaning-making world in which this kind of artifact is generated, in which people see it's worthwhile to invest the time, effort and resources to produce things like this. So Sword is saying it's through engaging with these objects and by asking obvious questions that we can start to unpick some of the assumptions that would have made these significant things, and therefore start to climb into the mindset of the people who produced or experienced this and related to it in some way. But of course, we do more than engage with individual artifacts. We engage with displays, with sequences of artifacts, And they are, in one sense, interpretations of history. So in addition to working at the level of individual artifacts, students can also think about how items are grouped together and how they're presented. Curating collections is about the curator constructing interpretations, but also students construct their interpretations as they engage with exhibitions. There are two levels to think about this: the intention of the curator in putting these materials together, and also the experience of the child in encountering these objects clustered together as they are. And Husbands points out that there is a very active role for us to think about ourselves and our children when we take them to museums as active interpreters of these stories. So he says it like this: we build interpretations from the objects, from the ways in which they're juxtaposed on display, from the ways in which they're labelled, and from the ways we interpret what we see, which in turn depends on the ideas about the past and its remains which we already have. Building interpretations, says Husbands, of the past depends on linking what we see to what we already think about the past, to the ideas that we and our children bring into the museum. So there's no guarantee that the curator's intention is communicated directly to us. As our children arrive with all of their preconceptions and pre-existing frameworks of meaning making in relation to the historical period they're studying, then they will encounter those objects and they will accommodate them into the frameworks that they already bring to the museum. So here's a quote from a website of the Museum of London, and I think this is interesting as we come to think about the implications of how we choose and encounter artefacts. This is reflecting on the nature of identity and diversity and how that's represented in museums. And the author of this essay on the Museum of London website put it like this: they said, all communities have the right to expect that their histories will be validated, whether that's through history texts, through the objects on display in museums, or through the recognition of intangible and material cultures. And that opens up the possibility of at least two distinctive teaching approaches when we plan our visit to a museum. On the one hand, we can identify gaps and silences. If we're visiting a national museum, for example, we can ask students to look for the stories which are dominant. So who in our current society is reflected in the museum stories? Who out of our current society appears to be marginalised or is even completely missing? And then we can think about the mismatch, the diversity of a modern society and the nature of the representations and absences. And the chances are, the older the exhibition, the older the curated galleries, the less inclusive those galleries may be, partly because the gap between our current society and the society that's represented in the galleries is bigger, but partly because a few generations ago curators and galleries were just less sensitive to this notion of being inclusive. The second teaching approach is to ask students to construct their own interpretation. So we could ask students as they tour around the gallery to collect artefacts by sketching or taking quick photographs on their mobile phones or digital cameras, and then to reflect on their visit afterwards to construct their own exhibition that tells an important story of their own choosing. And we could link this to asking students to think about their own families or their own communities and aspects of their own identity, to think about, if we were going to use these resources, what other stories could we create, or how could we pick out particularly dominant stories. These kinds of activities are really useful for focusing children on notions of representation and interpretations of evidence. So museums serve several distinctive purposes for the teacher. Most excitingly for children, it's a day out, it's a bit of variety, a chance to do something different. Most excitingly for the teacher, perhaps, it's the ability to engage with a much richer range of resources than we can bring to the classroom. It provides an engaging way to learn some curriculum content, and it gives us access to specialist knowledge in the form of the curators and the museum educators. But I think one of the most important things we can get out of a museum visit is to engage students in a more visceral way, to get them to think and feel their way into history, with the reality of history, and through that deeper engagement to provoke an intellectual and an emotional response which is simply deeper than we can generate in the classroom. So we need to think when we're organising a trip to a museum how we might prepare for that deeper engagement, because we don't just want this to be another comprehension activity or another sorting activity. We want this to resonate slightly more deeply with children, and therefore we need to think about what kinds of activities we're going to plan that would provoke that deeper response. So here are some of the references I've drawn on for this first part of the lecture. In the next part, I'm just going to say something about visiting sites and other places of interest, short of the organised museums and educational experience. And then in the third part, I'll go on and say something very briefly about the kind of planning questions teachers need to engage with.